The town of Willow's End woke to the sound of the church bell tolling, slow, deliberate, and hollow, as if each note carried the weight of a buried sin. The morning air was damp, the mist clinging low to the ground, muffling footsteps as neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn to the sound that called them without words. The path to St. Bartholomew's Seminary wound through bare oak trees, their branches black and slick from the night's rain. It was there, past the wooden fence, that the people saw the ruins, a skeletal frame of timbers blackened to the bone, leaning into each other like tired men too weary to stand. Father Elias Grayson stood before the gate, his cassock streaked with soot, his hands folded neatly as though in prayer. His face was calm, almost serene, the only movement the faint curl of steam rising from his damp hair. When asked what had happened, he said it plainly. The building had caught fire in the small hours before dawn, and all 19 boys inside had perished in their sleep. His voice carried no tremor, no hesitation, as though the words had been rehearsed. Yet there was something wrong with the scene, something the eyes noticed before the mind could name it. The air carried no trace of charred wood, no acrid tang of smoke that should have clung for days. The ground around the seminary was damp but unscarred, the grass still green where the flames should have scorched it. The timbers, though blackened, were unwarped, their edges sharp instead of curled by heat. It looked less like a building consumed by fire and more like one painted with the memory of it. Even so, no one asked these questions aloud. Father Grayson had been in Willow's End less than a year, yet he carried the kind of quiet authority that made dissent feel like sin. Graves were dug before noon, the raw earth piled in neat mounds behind the chapel. No coffins were seen brought in, but the priest explained this too, and the boys' bodies had been purified beyond form and required only to be returned to the earth quickly so their souls could rise unburdened. The families, stunned and trembling, nodded as if the words were both comfort and command. A line of simple wooden stakes was driven into the ground, each one painted with a single number instead of a name. Grayson blessed the graves in a short, measured prayer, the Latin rolling off his tongue in a rhythm almost too steady, as though time itself bowed to his control. The townsfolk lingered at the edge of the cemetery, speaking in low voices. Some thought they saw movement among the ruins earlier, shadows shifting in the doorway before the sun rose. Others recalled hearing the bell tolling in the dead of night, hours before the supposed fire began. No one admitted to hearing screams, though a few glanced at each other with the uneasy look of shared silence. The sheriff stood beside Grayson, his hat in his hands, and said nothing to the gathered crowd. He did not take notes, did not question the priest, did not inspect the charred beams. When evening came, the mist thickened again, swallowing the outline of the ruined building until it looked like a black stain in the fog. Inside their homes, families clutched the last letters their sons had written, reading them again and again, searching for hidden meaning. Some found sentences that now felt strange, words about being watched at night, about cleansing and quiet water, yet grief dulled the urge to investigate. In Willow's End, the church was the law, and Father Grayson was its voice. By the second day, the story of the seminary fire was already becoming fixed in the town's memory, repeated in the same calm, precise phrases Grayson had used. The truth, whatever it was, lay buried beneath numbered stakes in damp earth, locked behind the polite eyes of a man who had lost nothing but claimed to have lost everything. And though the bell no longer rang, its echo seemed to linger in the bones of the town, a hollow sound, warning of something that had not ended, only begun. Months before the fire, when Father Elias Grayson first arrived in Willow's End, the townsfolk had welcomed him with cautious curiosity. The seminary had been run for decades by Father Donnelly, a warm, round-faced man whose laugh could fill the chapel and whose sermons wandered like country roads. One Sunday in early spring, Donnelly was gone. No farewell, no service, only a notice on the chapel door stating that ill health had required his immediate retirement. In his place stood a tall, spare man with smooth black hair and a collar pressed so stiff it seemed carved. He spoke slowly, each word measured as if placing bricks in an unseen wall. His eyes never lingered too long on any one person, yet people walked away feeling as if they had been studied. The first weeks passed without incident, though small changes began to creep into daily life at the seminary. Locks appeared on doors that had never been locked before, especially the heavy oak ones leading to the cellar. The boys, once seen running through the yard in the afternoons, were now kept indoors during free hours. Grayson dismissed the old gardener and replaced him with a taciturn man from out of town who kept to the shadows and never joined the parish for supper. Meals at the seminary grew plainer, boiled roots, thin broth, and the boys' cheeks began to hollow. Parents noticed, but when they asked, Grayson assured them that fasting cleansed the spirit and strengthened resolve. His tone left little room for reply. On Sundays, his sermons were unlike those the town had known. Where Donnelly had spoken of forgiveness, Grayson spoke of purity. He described sin not as a failing of the heart, but as a sickness rooted in the flesh, one that could be drawn out with discipline, obedience, and God's refining trials. His voice never rose, but the silence that followed each sermon was heavy, as though his words had settled into the air like dust that would not lift. At night, strange sounds began drifting from the seminary. The bell would toll at hours when the town slept. Single low notes spaced far apart like the heartbeat of something deep underground. Windows in the upper dormitory glowed faintly well past midnight, their light dim and yellow as though filtered through thick glass. Some said they saw Grayson walking the perimeter with a lantern, his shadow bending unnaturally against the walls. The boys themselves changed. Letters home grew shorter, stripped of small joys. One mother, Mrs. Hollis, noticed her son's signature looked subtly altered, the loops tighter, the slant different, as if written by a careful mimic. When she asked him about it while visiting Sunday, he only smiled weakly and said he was learning to write the proper way. She left uneasy, though she could not name why. Grayson made himself visible in the town in ways that both reassured and unsettled. He visited the sick, sat with dying farmers, and spoke at community gatherings. His manners were impeccable, his posture unshakable, but there was always a sense that he was noting things. Who sat alone, who faltered in speech, who avoided his gaze. Children outside the seminary said he would stop them in the road, rest a hand on their shoulder, and ask strange questions about their dreams or how often they woke in the night. None of them liked to meet his eyes when answering. By the summer, his control over the seminary was absolute. The boys' routines were rebuilt from the ground up: early rising, cold water washings, hours of scripture recitation without pause. They were punished not with the rod, but with silence, locked in small windowless rooms where no sound could enter. Those who emerged were quieter, slower, their eyes holding a fixed glassy sheen. The town began to whisper, but in Willow's End, whispers rarely reached the pulpit. By autumn, the changes had taken root so deeply that when the fire came, no one truly knew what life inside the seminary had become. All they knew was that the man at its helm had replaced laughter with discipline, warmth with order, and the gentle chaos of youth with something so precise it felt unnatural. Father Grayson had not simply become their new shepherd, he had remade the flock in his image. The letters began thinning like breath on cold glass, fading month by month until they were more ritual than comfort. At first the boys wrote of lessons and chores, of scraping frost from dormer windows and laughing when the water in the pump stung their fingers. But by midsummer the tone shifted, pared down to clipped reports, obedient and drained of small delights. Parents compared notes at the mercantile and found the same creeping sameness. The sentences marched in the same order, the cross at the end sharpened to a fine needlepoint, and the handwriting pressed so evenly that it looked weighed upon by a ruler. One letter described a cleansing lullaby sung before sleep. Another praised the taste of plain broth as if reciting a script, and a third repeated the phrase, "We are watched with love," 4 times, the final line etched so deep it scored the paper. Mrs. Hollis, who kept every scrap her son ever wrote, held a page up to the window and saw faint impressions ghosting beneath the ink where earlier drafts had been traced, as though someone had taught his hand to move along a pattern until it obeyed. In Willow's End, people did not speak easily of fear, but their faces said what their mouths refused. At the harvest market, Matthew Lorne quietly gathered the families in the shadow of the grain scales and asked to see the latest notes. He laid them side by side in the dust and could not ignore the sameness, the way the letters tucked into themselves with military neatness, how the names of saints appeared in identical sequences like beads on a string. That night he wrote to the diocese for guidance, sealed the envelope, and then sat in the dark with his lamp unlit, listening to the bell toll once, twice, thrice, each stroke falling with the certainty of a measured heartbeat. The next day, Father Grayson introduced a new rule: no letters without inspection, no seals without his wax. He smiled when he announced it and spoke of protecting the boys from worldly temptations. But his eyes lingered on Matthew long enough to feel like a hand pressed to the back of the neck. From then on, the letters arrived on the same day each week, stacked neat as bricks, stamped with the priest's crest and smelling faintly of something clean and sour. Some parents noticed their sons had begun to sign with both given and baptismal names, a formality none of them used before. Others received only scripture verses copied without comment, the margins empty as a held breath. Rumors seeped through the town like damp through plaster. A baker's boy delivering loaves to the seminary said he heard soft sounds at night like speech without words, and the widow Cray, who lived close enough to see the dormitory windows, swore she watched shadowed figures standing motionless for hours as if waiting to be moved. In late autumn, the boys were seen less often outside, their walks reduced to narrow circles in the courtyard with a supervisor keeping time, a metronome in his hand clicking steadily like teeth. On visiting Sunday, the schedule became a parade. Families brought into a small parlor one by one, a clock on the mantel counting down 15 minutes while a boy sat upright with folded hands, answering questions with gentle, flattened phrases. When Mrs. Klein asked her nephew what he did in classes, he smiled and said, "We learn to hold still." When she laughed and asked if he was joking, his smile did not move. Later, Matthew overheard 2 boys at the pump whispering about water that was not cold and rooms that sang. One said the world sounded far away in there, like the bottom of a pond. The other hushed him and pointed toward the chapel where Grayson stood, his gaze quietly sweeping the yard as if searching for a single broken thread. After that day, the letters changed again. They became lists, hours prayed, chapters memorized, meals consumed with gratitude. In the place of stories, the boys began to describe dreams vivid and recurring of being lowered into bright water that did not wet them, of floating while their limbs grew light, of a bell muffled as if rung under a blanket. Some wrote that the dreams were a test. Some wrote that they woke with the taste of coins in their mouth. Mrs. Hollis brought her concerns to the sheriff, who tipped his hat toward the seminary and said the church had its ways and that discipline built good men. He told her not to stir panic and promised to speak with the priest, though he never did. That week, every family received a small slip of paper included with the letters bearing the same sentence in careful hand. Purity requires witness. Matthew copied the phrase into his notebook and underlined it twice. He began noticing other patterns. The letters all avoided mention of the cellar, referring instead to lower rooms. None included the word fear, substituting trial or wait. And when a boy wrote of feeling tired, he always corrected it to hushed, as if the word itself had been denied them. A frosted morning brought a letter from a boy named Abel Corbett that contained only 5 lines, each ending with the same phrase as prescribed, which made no sense to anyone. Mrs. Corbett folded it into her apron, and by evening she had it memorized like a prayer she despised. Matthew could not shake the feeling that the letters were not written to the families at all, but to whoever checked them before they were sent, a performance delivered with careful posture and still eyes. He imagined a hand guiding another hand, reshaping loops, pressing down when the pen hesitated, until the page stood at attention. Autumn hardened into the kind of cold that makes wood ring when struck, and still the letters came on time, faithful as footsteps on a corridor. One envelope arrived damp, and when Mrs. Hollis dried it by the hearth, pale threads of wax peeled from the flap in neat curls like shavings, and the paper beneath showed faint parallel grooves as though it had been laid upon something rigid while written. She pressed her fingers into those grooves and felt a tremble rise that was not from the cold. By then the town had learned to read what was absent as much as what was present. Not a word about birthdays, no mention of laughter, no request for sweets. Instead, the same closing line, fixed and obedient. I remain grateful for the work being done in me. It was a sentence that sounded like surrender, and it carried in its quiet a warning none of them yet understood. Matthew Lorne had never been the kind of man to seek trouble, but the unease had settled in his bones like a slow fever. For weeks after the fire, his mind kept returning to a night the previous winter when he had been grading papers by lamplight and noticed the seminary's windows still aglow far past curfew. The snow outside was crusted with ice, making each step across it sound like breaking glass. Drawn by a mixture of concern and something colder, he had left his house and walked the narrow path toward the school. From the road, the main building looked still, the light upstairs dim and steady. But as he rounded the side, he saw it, a sliver of lamplight spilling from the cellar shutters, its glow flickering as if something moved between the flame and the wall. Curiosity wrestled with caution as he crouched near the window. The shutters were nearly closed, but through a gap the width of 2 fingers he could see inside. The room was low-ceilinged, its stone walls sweating in the damp, and along one side stood rows of shallow basins, metal, perhaps copper, their rims catching the light. In each basin was a clear, thick liquid that glistened like syrup under the lamplight. Beneath the surface of that liquid, pale shapes lay still. At first, Matthew thought they were mannequins, practice forms for anatomy lessons, but as he leaned closer, he saw fingernails, small and clean, and the faint shadow of an ear pressed against the curved side of the basin. The liquid moved slightly as if stirred from below, though the bodies did not. The lamplight shifted and a figure stepped into view. Father Grayson wore a black apron over his cassock, the sleeves of his shirt rolled high, exposing forearms marked with faint red lines as though from repeated splashes. He held a long-handled ladle, which he dipped into one basin before pouring the liquid slowly over the face of the form inside. His expression did not change, not focus, not strain, just a calm, methodical rhythm as if tending to something that could not be rushed. Once he finished at one basin, he moved to the next, humming under his breath, though the tune was too low to catch. Matthew's breath clouded the glass, and he leaned back quickly, afraid the condensation would give him away. His heart pounded, but his eyes refused to leave the slit of light. The last basin held something smaller, the outline of shoulders and head barely breaking the surface. Here, Grayson paused longer. resting the ladle across the rim and dipping his hand directly into the liquid. He stroked whatever lay beneath, his thumb moving in slow circles, and for a moment Matthew thought he saw the faintest ripple across the lips of the shape. Not breath, but a twitch, like the reflex of a body not yet entirely surrendered. He stumbled back from the shutters, boots crunching on the crusted snow, and made for the road without looking behind him. By the time he reached his home, his skin stung from the cold, but the deeper chill came from what he had seen. Not the basins themselves, but the patience in Grayson's movements, the absence of hesitation. It was the work of someone who believed wholly in what he was doing. The next day, Matthew went to the sheriff. He chose his words carefully, omitting what could sound like fevered imagining, and described the basins, the liquid, the bodies. The sheriff listened, expression unreadable, then told him the church's methods were not his jurisdiction, and that the town had no reason to doubt Father Grayson's care. As they spoke, a knock sounded at the door. Grayson entered without waiting to be invited, his smile as mild as spring. He carried a basket of bread and honey, which he set on the desk as a small token for the sheriff's continued support. Then, turning to Matthew, he asked if the long winter nights were treating him well, and whether his lamp burned later than it should. His voice was even, but his gaze held steady, the kind that fixed a man in place without force. That night, Matthew locked his own doors for the first time in years. Still, he could not stop himself from glancing toward the seminary each time he passed its street. The cellar shutters were always closed now, the gap sealed with a strip of nailed wood. Yet some nights, when the wind was still, he thought he could hear the faint sound of liquid being poured, a slow, deliberate stream that stopped and started with the rhythm of a measured hand. In Willow's End, such sounds carried far, even through stone walls, and once heard, they stayed in the mind long after silence returned. By the time the fire came, Matthew had told no one else what he'd seen. But the image of those pale forms suspended in their gleaming baths would haunt him. Not only for what they were, but for the way Father Grayson had tended them, as though preserving something precious, not laying anything to rest. The journals were found years later hidden in a false wall of the seminary's library, a space no larger than a shoebox, sealed with boards so flush they seemed part of the structure itself. Inside lay 4 leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked but the pages meticulously preserved. Each was numbered, dated, and written in the same precise, slanted hand. The earliest entries began with scripture copied in neat columns, but soon the margins filled with annotations that were not devotional at all. Father Grayson wrote of extracting the root of corruption and refining the spirit through the body's dissolution. He described flesh not as a vessel, but as a barrier, a membrane between the soul and its perfection. And he recorded a series of experiments intended to thin that membrane without destroying the life within. At least not immediately. In the second volume, the language grew more clinical. There were sketches of the copper basins Matthew had once glimpsed, their dimensions exact, each accompanied by notes on curvature and depth to ensure even saturation. The liquid, he explained, was a refining agent, a mixture of heated mineral salts, distilled spirits, and ground limestone. When maintained at a constant warmth just below boiling, it would leach the natural oils from the skin without breaking it, allowing sins of the flesh to be drawn out as impurities, visible in a faint milky film on the surface. According to Grayson, the process was not meant to kill swiftly. He believed the soul's release could only be made permanent if the body surrendered in stages, each one marked by a reduction in will, voice, and memory. One section, titled The Phases of Purity, detailed these stages in unsettling calm. In the first phase, the subject's skin became pale and almost translucent, the capillaries narrowing until blood no longer flushed the surface. In the second, the nerve endings dulled, producing a state of perfect stillness in which pain and pleasure were equally absent. The third phase, which he referred to as the hushed hour, involved the removal of the subject's capacity for speech, not through injury alone but by stilling the voice at its root, a combination of physical alteration and chemical paralysis. The final phase, release, was never described in plain terms, only hinted at through notes on burial depth, soil composition, and the use of small bells to mark the ascension. Interspersed between these records were biblical references, each twisted into justification. The drowning of Pharaoh's army became an allegory for cleansing. The transfiguration of Christ was described as a remaking of the flesh. Where most saw metaphor, Grayson saw instruction. He believed the divine required not mere repentance but transformation, a transformation that could be engineered, measured, and perfected. The journals also revealed how long he had been preparing. He recorded trials in other towns, each one involving a small group of orphans or undesirables entrusted to him by church officials eager to be rid of them. In these earlier attempts, he lamented the lack of proper facilities, noting how cold drafts or inconsistent heat spoiled the purification before completion. St. Bartholomew's Seminary, he wrote, was his first true opportunity, a building with the space, privacy, and authority to carry out the work without interruption. The fire, he hinted, had not been an accident but a calculated stage in the process. Ash is a language the living cannot read. What disturbed Matthew most when he read the recovered pages was the absence of doubt. There was no struggle, no sense of moral weight, only an unwavering belief in the necessity of what he called the work. The language was as serene as his sermons, the sentences ordered and free of hesitation. Even when describing the moment a child ceased to respond, Grayson wrote as though noting the ripening of fruit. The timing precise, the outcome inevitable. Tucked into the back of the fourth volume was a folded sheet, stained with what looked like mineral residue. On it was a diagram labeled Continuous Cycle, depicting a series of connected basins with heated channels running between them. Arrows marked the flow of the refining agent, looping endlessly so that each subject could be rotated from one stage to the next without cooling. At the bottom, in smaller script, was a single line. The flesh remembers what the soul has forgotten, until we teach it otherwise. The discovery of these journals did not lead to an immediate reckoning. Those who found them, a young priest cataloging old shelves and 2 elders of the parish, brought them quietly to the diocese. The books were locked away, their contents discussed in hushed tones among a handful of men who decided that exposing them would do more harm than good. It was easier to preserve the fire as the official story, to let the numbered graves stand unquestioned, than to admit that a man in holy robes had turned the seminary into a place of unholy invention. But the pages had a way of lingering. Matthew, who was given one night to read them before they were taken, could not erase the images from his mind. The basins glowing in lamplight, the pale bodies suspended like unfinished works, the methodical pace of a man who believed he was saving souls by dismantling the human frame. He understood then that the fire had been not an end, but a curtain, drawn to hide the fact that what Grayson had begun was never meant to end at all. It was nearly 3 weeks after the fire when the river gave up its first truth. The thaw had come early that year, loosening the frozen banks and pulling clumps of soil into the current. A farmhand named Daniel Pike was clearing debris near the bend when his spade struck something that rang faintly against the metal. At first he thought it was a rock, but as he scraped away the wet earth, a pale curve emerged, smooth, taut, and cold as porcelain. His first thought was ice, but then his fingers found the fine ridges of human ribs. Word spread fast in Willow's End, and by the time the sheriff arrived, 6 men stood ankle-deep in the mud, their eyes fixed on what the river had unearthed. Together they pulled the body free. It was small, no older than 13, and unlike anything they had expected. The skin was hairless, bleached to a milky translucence through which the faint map of veins could be seen. The eyes were closed, the lids thin enough to show the pale discs beneath, and the lips had tightened back to reveal teeth that looked too white for the grave. There was no smell of decay, only a faint mineral tang like wet limestone. The hands were folded neatly against the chest, fingers stiff and unnaturally straight, as if they had been bound that way before death. Daniel swore the body felt dry to the touch, as though whatever had preserved it had drawn out every drop of natural moisture. The joints did not bend when they tried to move it. Instead, the limbs shifted in one piece like carved wood. Beneath the nails was no dirt, no sign of the earth it had been buried in. Only a fine powder that left a chalky residue on their fingers. That powder would later be matched to lime deposits from the seminary's cellars, though at the time, no one dared suggest such a connection aloud. The sheriff glanced at Father Grayson, who had arrived without seeming to be summoned. The priest looked upon the body with the same mild interest he might show to a painting in need of repair. He knelt beside it, touched the smooth cheek, and murmured that the river was full of relics. Perhaps this one sent by God to test their faith. When someone asked if it was one of the missing boys, he replied that grief could make strangers out of the familiar, and that the fire had left none intact enough to match. His voice carried the same quiet certainty as always, and the sheriff, visibly uneasy, ordered the body reburied in the churchyard that very evening. It was done quickly, without service, the grave marked only with another numbered stake. Those who had seen it tried to speak of what they'd noticed, the absence of hair, the impossibly smooth skin, but their words faltered under the weight of the priest's gaze. A few whispered that the body looked unfinished, like a sculpture abandoned mid-carving. Others said it seemed not dead at all, but paused as though some part of it still waited to be completed. Matthew Lorne, who had heard of the find only after the reburial, walked alone to the riverbank that night. The moon lit the churn of the current, and in its shifting light he thought he saw other pale shapes deep below, sliding past like stones turned by the water. Each time the moon slipped behind a cloud, the shapes vanished, leaving only the sound of the river heavy and constant. By the following morning, the town had convinced itself the body was a trick. Perhaps a preserved corpse from some medical college in the city planted to stir unrest. Father Grayson encouraged this theory in quiet conversations, even suggesting that enemies of the church were trying to tarnish their name. The sheriff repeated these words in the tavern that night, and soon the river's gift became little more than another whisper tucked away among the rest. Yet for those who had seen it, the memory clung. They would speak of the way the moonlight caught on that smooth skin, of the strange dryness in the damp air, and of the feeling, hard to name but impossible to shake, that the body had not been laid to rest at all, but stored, waiting for a hand that had been interrupted mid-task. The storm came without warning, a black mass rolling low across the fields, bending the bare branches until they clawed at the sky. Rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the churchyard into a sucking mire, the numbered stakes leaning like drunkards in the wind. By dawn, the far edge of the cemetery had collapsed where the slope met the creek below, the soil washed away in a jagged cut. The ground gaped open, revealing what lay beneath the graves of 6 of the 19. It was not the boys. In the first pit, instead of a coffin, there was a burlap sack heavy with sodden ash. When the sack tore under the probing stick of a farmer, bones spilled out, not smooth human bones, but the rough, yellowed fragments of livestock. Another grave held only a scattering of feathers and charred sticks bound with twine. A third contained a barrel sealed tight, inside which sloshed a slurry of water, ash, and something that gave off the faint odor of burnt hair. None of it made sense, not for a burial, not for 19 children who had supposedly perished together. Families gathered in the rain, their faces drawn tight, their clothes plastered to their skin. Mrs. Hollis clutched her shawl against her chest as if to keep her ribs from splitting. She demanded the graves be opened in full, that every one of the stakes be checked. Father Grayson stepped forward, his voice calm as a still pond. He told them that the Lord's mysteries were not for them to disturb, that some rites could not be explained without damaging the sanctity of the soul's journey. His words had the weight of command disguised as counsel, and yet a low murmur of dissent rose among the crowd. The sheriff stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the rain stream down Grayson's face without touching the eyes. After a long pause, he ordered the graves filled in again, saying the storm had made the ground unstable. He promised there would be a proper examination later, though no one believed it. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, their shoes dragging through the mud, their eyes avoiding the broken edge where the earth had given up its secret. That night, Matthew Lorne could not sleep. The image of those false graves gnawed at him until he left his house with only a lantern and the pistol his father had left him. He crossed the silent town and made his way to the seminary's ruins, the charred timbers glistening with rain. There he waited in the shadows, his breath clouding in the cold. Hours passed before movement stirred, the creak of wood, the soft grind of wheels. Out of the darkness emerged a cart, its driver hunched under a wide-brimmed hat, a lantern swinging from the side. On the cart lay shapes under a heavy tarpaulin, the edges fluttering just enough for Matthew to see the outline of small, still forms. The cart did not head toward the churchyard. Instead, it rolled slowly down the old logging trail that led into the forest, a trail few used since the mill had closed years earlier. Matthew followed at a distance, his lantern shuddered, his footsteps muffled by the wet ground. The path narrowed, the trees crowding closer, their branches dripping like blackened fingers. After what felt like an hour, the cart turned into a clearing he did not know existed. The driver, Grayson himself, climbed down, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He untied the tarp and began lifting the forms one by one, carrying them toward a cluster of shapes hanging from the trees. Matthew's stomach turned as he crept closer. In the dim light, he saw they were bells. Dozens of small brass bells, each tied to a low branch with twine. Beneath every bell was a shallow pit, half filled with a cloudy, viscous liquid that caught the lamplight like dull glass. Within each pit lay a child's body, some pale and rigid, others softened, their features blurred as though they were being slowly erased. The bells swayed in the damp breeze, their sound faint but constant, a chiming too soft to comfort, too steady to ignore. Grayson lowered each new body into its own pit, adjusting their position so the head rested directly beneath the bell. He dipped a ladle into the liquid and poured it over their faces, the motion slow and practiced, as though anointing them. When he finished, he stood for a long moment, eyes closed, listening to the uneven chorus of bells. His lips moved soundlessly, and Matthew could not tell if it was prayer or counting. Matthew's hands shook as he backed away, the cold creeping into his bones. He knew then that the graves in the churchyard were not empty by accident. They had been emptied by design. Whatever the fire had destroyed, it was not the boys. They were here, suspended between life and whatever Grayson believed came after, marked by bells that would ring for no one but him. By the time Matthew returned to town, dawn was breaking, the storm clouds thinning to pale strips of gray. He did not go to the sheriff. He did not go to the families. Instead, he sat at his desk, staring at a blank page, knowing that whatever words he chose would never carry the full weight of what he had seen, and that speaking them aloud might ensure the bells in the forest would one day ring for him as well. The clearing lay far from any marked trail, shielded by thick rows of cedar that muffled the wind and kept the air unnervingly still. Matthew Lorne returned 3 nights later carrying no lantern this time, guided only by the memory of that strange metallic chiming. It began faintly, a single bell swaying with the night air, and grew into a layered whisper of tones, each one slightly off from the others, the sound unsteady and strangely human in its unevenness. The smell reached him before the sight, a faint mineral tang like the inside of a cold cellar, mixed with something sweet and rancid that clung to the back of the throat. In the dim spill of moonlight through the cedar branches, the grove revealed itself. Dozens of brass bells hung from branches barely higher than a man's head, each one tied with twine darkened by damp and age. Beneath every bell yawned a shallow pit, no more than a foot deep, lined with stones and filled with a cloudy, viscous fluid. The surfaces trembled faintly, disturbed not by wind but by what lay beneath. The bodies, children's bodies, rested half-submerged, their heads angled upwards so the crown sat directly below the dangling bell. Their eyes were closed, their skin pale and smooth as though polished. Some appeared untouched by decay, while others had softened around the edges, their features blurring into the liquid. The bells themselves were not identical. Some bore faint engravings of crosses or vines, others were plain but for small nicks and scratches. They swayed with a rhythm that seemed independent of the breeze, as if answering to a current no one could see. Each chime, soft as it was, cut into Matthew's nerves like the repeated drip of water in a silent room. He realized then the bells were more than markers. They were instruments, each note distinct as if tuned to its occupant. From the shadows a figure emerged, and Matthew froze. Father Grayson stepped into the clearing with the composure of a man arriving at a sacred place. He carried a covered pail and a ladle, setting them down beside the nearest pit. Kneeling, he uncovered the pail and dipped the ladle into its contents, a pale, shimmering fluid that caught the moonlight like molten silver. With slow precision, he poured it over the face of the body beneath the bell, the liquid pooling briefly before sinking into the cloudy mixture below. The bell above gave a soft, solitary note as if in acknowledgement. Grayson whispered something, his head bowed, then moved to the next pit. The process repeated, each act unhurried, deliberate. He tended to each child in turn, pouring, adjusting their position, and in some cases gently wiping the surface of the skin with his bare hand, as if removing invisible residue. He seemed less like a man performing a burial rite, and more like a craftsman maintaining something delicate, something in progress. At one pit he paused longer, resting his hand against the child's sternum. Matthew could not see what prompted the hesitation. But after a moment Grayson straightened and rang the bell above with 2 slow pulls of the twine, producing a note that lingered in the cold air. Matthew's breath came shallow, every instinct telling him to leave, but he could not turn away. He noticed that the pits were not uniform in state. Some liquid was clearer, the bodies beneath sharper in detail, while others were clouded. The forms almost dissolved into the stone-lined hollow. It was as though each pit marked a stage, the same stages Matthew had read about in the hidden journals. From untouched flesh to blurred outlines until only a suggestion of a form remained. The bells perhaps marked the passage between them. Grayson moved without hurry, the night around him folding into the rhythm of his work. When the last child had been tended, he stood at the center of the grove and slowly turned, his gaze sweeping over every pit, every bell. Then he knelt again, this time at an empty hole near the far edge. He reached into his cassock and withdrew a small silver cross, pressing it into the damp soil at the center. From the pocket of his apron, he pulled a strip of paper and pinned it to the cross with a small iron tack. Though Matthew was too far to read it, he knew instinctively it was a name. Perhaps the next one. When Grayson finally left, his pail empty, the grove seemed to breathe in his absence. The bells kept chiming, a soft, uneven chorus that seemed to carry farther now, slipping through the trees and into the darkness. Matthew waited until the sound dulled before stepping closer. He could see his reflection in the surface of the clearer pits, warped and shifting. One child's hand rested against the stone edge, the fingers slightly curled, the nails faintly ridged as though something had been scraped from them. In the liquid beside the wrist, a thread of pale material drifted lazily, vanishing into the clouded depths. Matthew left the grove in silence, but the bells followed him in his mind. Each note seemed to lodge itself in the space between thought and memory, so that even in the stillness of his own home he swore he could hear them, counting the moments, waiting. The decision to act came not from courage, but from the gnawing certainty that if they waited any longer, there would be nothing left to save. Matthew Lorne returned from the grove with the sound of those bells still clinging to him, and that night he sought out two men he trusted. Elias Rourke, a farmer whose youngest boy had been lost in the fire, and Silas Meade, a mill hand who had seen enough strange comings and goings from the seminary to know the fire was only smoke without flame. They met in the back of Rourke's barn, voices low, hands restless. All three knew that to accuse a priest in Willow's End was to invite ruin, but all three also knew that the sound of those bells, or the silence that would follow them, was a worse fate. They chose a night when the moon was thin and the clouds heavy. Each man carried a lantern hooded in cloth, a pry bar, and a length of rope. Matthew led them through the overgrown path to the seminary's rear, where the cellar doors sat flush with the ground. The wood was new, the lock thick and polished. Rourke set to it with the pry bar, the sound of wood splitting muffled under the wind's low groan. When the latch finally gave out, the smell rose, not of rot, but of something acrid, chemical, and metallic all at once, a scent that burned the nose and tightened the throat. They descended the narrow steps into a heat that seemed to come from nowhere. The cellar was lit by a series of oil lamps, their flames dimmed but steady. At the far end stood the copper still Matthew had glimpsed months before, but now he saw it in its full, terrible form, coils of hammered metal snaking into a wide stone trough, the surface of the liquid within shifting in slow, thick ripples. Beside it, on the damp stone floor, sat 7 boys, each shackled to an iron ring in the wall by chains no thicker than a finger but strong enough to keep them still. The boys were silent, not from caution but because they could not speak. A glance at their throats revealed the truth, thin, pale lines running along the base of the neck, scars too precise to be accidental. Their eyes, wide and wet, tracked the lantern light without expression. Their skin was unnaturally smooth, their hair cropped short and uneven, as if someone had shorn them quickly and without care. The youngest's lips parted soundlessly, and Matthew saw the raw pink where a tongue should have moved but didn't. Rourke knelt beside his son, trying to speak through a mouth gone dry. The boy leaned into his father's chest but made no sound, no sob, no breathless relief, only the mechanical weight of a body seeking the shape it once knew. Silas moved to break the chains, but each strike of the pry bar seemed to echo through the room, and with each echo came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps above. Grayson appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the noise, the black of his cassock swallowing the light. He did not shout or rush toward them. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and drew a slender scalpel from the pocket of his apron. The blade caught the lamplight with a cold gleam. His expression was one of mild disappointment, as if they had opened a door to a room they'd been told was off limits. "You don't understand what you're undoing," he said, his voice low but steady. "They're not ready to leave." The 3 men froze, the still's coils hissing softly beside them. Grayson moved closer, the scalpel held lightly, almost delicately in his fingers. "You've seen the sickness in them," he continued, "the impurity that clings like oil to the skin. This is the only way to strip it clean. You call it cruelty because you can't imagine what comes after." His eyes found Matthew's. "But I've seen it. I've heard it in the bells." Rourke stepped between the priest and his son, his shoulders squared. "You'll hear nothing from them ever again," he said, his voice shaking more from rage than fear. He swung the pry bar, the motion clumsy in the cramped space. Grayson sidestepped, but the movement forced him toward the wall, his back now close to the still. Silas moved quickly, shoving him hard against the stone. The scalpel clattered to the floor, skidding into the trough's cloudy surface where it vanished with a faint hiss. Matthew fumbled for the keys at Grayson's belt, the priest twisting violently but pinned by Rourke's weight. One by one, the chains fell away from the boy's wrists and ankles. They did not run. They did not even stand until Matthew and Silas pulled them up, their limbs awkward, their balance unsteady. The heat in the cellar seemed to grow thicker, the chemical scent rising as if the still itself had been disturbed by the struggle. Grayson stopped resisting, his eyes fixed on the boys, his lips moving in silent words. For a moment, Matthew thought he was praying. But then he realized the priest's gaze wasn't on the boys at all. It was on the on the slow swirl of liquid in its basin. His lips curved almost imperceptibly, the faintest hint of a smile, as though the real work had already been done and this interruption was only a pause. They bound his hands and dragged him toward the steps. The boys followed in a slow, stumbling line, their heads turning in unison to glance back at the still as they passed it, each one tilting his head slightly at the same moment, as if hearing something the men could not. The bells were far away, deep in the forest, but Matthew swore that in the stillness of the cellar he could hear a faint echo, uneven, distant, and patient. They brought Grayson into town at dawn, his wrists bound with coarse rope, his cassock streaked with dirt from the cellar floor. Word spread quickly, and by midday the streets were lined with people straining to see him as the sheriff led him toward the courthouse. He walked without resistance, his head slightly bowed, the calm in his face unchanged. The 7 boys were kept apart, sheltered in the vestry of the smaller chapel, their silence unbroken except for the sound of their shallow breathing. The sheriff told the crowd they would testify, that the court would hear the truth, but those who had seen the boys knew the truth already. No jury could be moved by words that could not be spoken. The trial began in a packed chamber, the air heavy with the smell of damp coats and the metallic tang of the stove burning in the corner. The charges were read aloud: unlawful imprisonment, grievous bodily harm, and the unholy desecration of minors under his care. But the language seemed thin beside what people knew, or thought they knew. When called to speak, Grayson rose slowly, his bound hands resting lightly on the table. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying through the hall like a sermon. He told them he had been entrusted with souls bent under the weight of inherited sin, that he had found them clouded, unformed, chained by appetites they could not name. He said the baths were not punishment but remedy, still not a prison but an altar. The prosecutor objected to his preaching, but Grayson did not falter. He quoted scripture with the ease of a man pouring water, twisting each passage into something that sounded almost reasonable until one looked too closely. He spoke of the bells in the grove as guides for the departing spirit, their sound calling the soul upward when the body no longer held it fast. When asked why the graves were empty, he smiled faintly and said, "Because the bodies were not yet ready for the earth." The boys were brought in one by one, each led by a parish nurse. Their eyes darted over the crowd without recognition, their mouths closed as though stitched. When the prosecutor asked them to identify their captor, they simply stood silent, their hands limp at their sides. The scars at their throats were visible even from the back of the room. A murmur swept through the crowd. Not outrage, but a low, uneasy sound, like the shifting of chairs before a hymn. The judge called for order, but it was already clear. There would be no testimony that could withstand the law's hunger for direct evidence. Matthew Lorne took the stand, his account steady but marked by the strain of knowing how much he could not prove. He told of the cellar, the basins, the boys in chains. He spoke of following Grayson into the forest and finding the grove of bells. The defense asked if he had any witness to these claims. He did not. When pressed, he admitted he had not brought any of the townspeople to see the grove, fearing what Grayson might do if cornered. His words, though detailed, were treated as the troubled imaginings of a man too close to the families to be impartial. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Grayson not guilty of murder. There was no proof of death in the eyes of the law, but guilty of moral corruption and endangerment. The judge declared him unfit for the duties of the priesthood, but instead of prison, he was sentenced to indefinite confinement in the state asylum for observation and treatment. The order was read aloud, and a deputy stepped forward to escort him from the chamber. As he passed the boys' bench, Grayson paused. He looked at them one by one, his eyes soft with something that could have been sorrow or pride. Then he turned to the crowd and said, "You have saved nothing. The work is patient. It will wait for me." His voice was low, but every ear caught it. The sheriff tightened his grip on Grayson's arm and pushed him toward the waiting wagon. The gavel fell and the room emptied into the gray afternoon. The bells of St. Bartholomew's Chapel did not ring that day, but for those who had stood in the grove, the absence was not silence at all. Only the pause between notes. The state asylum sat on a wind-swept rise 2 days' journey from Willow's End, a sprawling brick complex ringed by high iron fencing and fields left to wild grass. Father Grayson arrived there in the autumn of 1849, a single trunk in tow and the same calm composure that had carried him through his trial. The staff noted his neatness, his quiet obedience, and his habit of standing perfectly still for long stretches as if listening for something far away. He attended chapel without prompting, ate without complaint, and never raised his voice. To most of the orderlies, he was just another harmless cleric whose mind had wandered into delusion. But the night staff saw more. They spoke of how Grayson never truly slept, only lay in his bed with his eyes half-lidded, the moonlight catching on them like glass. Sometimes in the small hours, he could be heard murmuring, the syllables measured and repetitive as though counting. The guards on rotation swore they sometimes heard faint metallic chimes in the corridor outside his cell, though no bells were permitted in the ward. When they checked, they would find nothing but Grayson sitting at the edge of his bed with his hands resting lightly on his knees. It was decades later, long after Grayson's death, that the hidden compartment was found. In 1887, a young orderly named Robert Maddox was repairing a rotted section of the wall in Grayson's old cell when his chisel rang against metal. Pulling away the plaster, he uncovered a narrow recess sealed with a fitted panel. Inside lay a small tin box, its lid marked with a hand-engraved cross. The box contained folded papers, small enough to be concealed in a sleeve or pocket, their edges brittle but the ink shockingly dark. These were not sermons, but diagrams and lists, each labeled in the same careful hand Matthew Lorne had seen in the journals years before. One drawing showed a larger, more elaborate still, capable of holding twice the volume of liquid. Another depicted a circular arrangement of pits, each linked by narrow channels, the bells above them connected by a thin network of wire. The notes described a continuous cycle in which subjects could be rotated through stages without disruption, with temperature and mineral concentration precisely maintained. There were also maps, crude but recognizable outlines of towns and rural areas, each marked with a cross where facilities might be established. One map bore a date just 3 years before Grayson's sentencing, suggesting he had been planning expansions even while running St. Bartholomew's Seminary. In the margins of these maps were strange annotations: suitable timber, deep water, unsuspecting flock. Perhaps most disturbing were the fragments of what appeared to be correspondence. Though no signatures were present, the tone implied Grayson had been in contact with others who shared his beliefs. One note read, "The process will be completed when there is no hesitation to begin." Another, "The work is patient. It is carried on by willing hands." The handwriting varied, confirming they were not all written by Grayson. Maddox turned the papers over to the asylum superintendent, who, rather than alert the authorities, quietly stored them in the administrative archive. His notes in the logbook described them only as delusional writings of a deceased inmate, but over time rumors spread among the staff about what the papers had contained. Some claimed the diagrams showed more than instruments, that there were lists of names, dates, and even physical descriptions of children matching those from missing person notices across several counties. Others said the papers included coded prayers, each ending with the same line: "Release requires no witness. No official inquiry was ever launched." The tin box remained in the asylum's archive untouched until a flood in 1903 destroyed many of the older records. By then, the story of Father Grayson had settled into a local legend. The fire, the numbered graves, the quiet removal to an asylum. The grove of bells was spoken of only in whispers, and always with the unspoken fear that it might still stand somewhere beyond the cedar trees, waiting for the right hands to return. For those who had seen him in life, there was no comfort in his confinement. Grayson's calm in the asylum had been the same calm in the cellar, the same calm in the courtroom. It was the calm of a man who never believed he had been stopped, only delayed. In the early years of the 20th century, a traveling historian named Charles Whitley came to Willow's End to compile a record of its earliest settlements. He was not looking for scandal, only the dry facts of old churches, land deeds, and parish registers. Yet while examining the remains of St. Bartholomew's Seminary, long since reduced to a skeletal ruin of charred beams and sagging stone, he noticed something strange. The blackened timbers had not crumbled into ash as firewood should, nor had they warped or split under intense heat. Instead, the surface layer of the wood seemed only stained, a thin crust of brittle black that flaked away beneath his knife to reveal pale, unburned pine beneath. Whitley's curiosity deepened when he tested a small flake in his camp stove. It gave off no scent of smoke, only a faint chemical tang that clung to the air. In his notes, he described it as the odor of an apothecary's jar after years of disuse. He sent samples to a chemist in Des Moines, who returned a puzzling report. The residue was not the product of combustion at all, but of a mineral wash containing manganese and lime, substances known to darken wood on contact without weakening its structure. It was a treatment, not the remains of fire. This discovery unraveled the town's long-accepted narrative. If the wood had not truly burned, then what of the 19 boys who were said to have perished in the flames? Whitley's research turned up another troubling detail. The only eyewitness accounts of the blaze came from Father Grayson himself and the sheriff, neither of whom described seeing the boys' bodies before burial. In the parish records, the deaths were recorded in identical phrases written in the same careful hand, all entered on the same day. And none included descriptions of injuries consistent with fire. As Whitley pressed further, older residents began to speak in cautious fragments. A widow remembered waking that night to the sound of the church bell ringing before the fire was ever said to have started. Another recalled seeing Grayson walking the lane at dawn with a lantern and a cart, though the cart was covered too tightly to reveal what it carried. A former farmhand, now in his 80s, whispered to Whitley that he had once seen Grayson soaking timber in long troughs of liquid, though he had assumed it was some form of weatherproofing. Whitley's suspicion hardened into a theory. The fire had been staged, a false ruin painted onto the building to mask the removal of the boys. The mineral wash, when applied to the outer surfaces, would have blackened the wood convincingly enough for casual inspection, especially if the smell of burning could be mimicked with smoldering straw or pitch. With no flames consuming the structure, there would have been time to move bodies, living or dead, elsewhere without drawing notice. He traced the timeline against the journals recovered from the seminary years before. The references to ash as a language the living cannot read and preparing the vessel for relocation took on a new, sharper meaning. The grove of bells, hidden deep in the forest, could have been the true destination for the boys, the fire no more than a curtain drawn across the eyes of the town. Whitley's findings were never published in a formal history. When he approached the diocese for comment, he was met with polite dismissal and a request to turn over his notes for preservation in the proper archive. He refused, but soon after his research trunk was stolen from his boarding room. The lock splintered and the window left open to the rain. Though he suspected the theft was no ordinary burglary, he had no proof. He left Willow's End within the month, his work unfinished, and never returned. Still, fragments of his notes survived in letters he had sent to colleagues. In these, he detailed the chemical composition of the residue and its known uses, mostly in preservation, not destruction. He speculated that the same mineral formula might have been used in the basins found in the seminary cellar and in the forest pits, the blackened wood and the pale bodies linked by the same process. It was not only about concealment, it was about continuity. The false fire had not ended Grayson's work. It had moved it somewhere the eyes of the living would not go. In later decades, a small group of local historians quietly took up Whitley's theory. They searched the old logging trails, the cedar groves, and the abandoned homesteads beyond the town's edge. They found no bells, no basins, no bodies, only faint depressions in the ground where stones might once have been set, and the rusted hinge of what could have been a hanging frame. One young researcher claimed to have found a strip of twine with traces of brass patina embedded in its fibers, but the object was lost before it could be tested. The official story of the seminary fire remains unchanged in church records to this day. But in Willow's End, the truth moves differently. It travels in the space between what was seen and what was allowed to be remembered, in the way people still glance toward the tree line when the wind carries a faint metallic chime. Some say the sound is only the memory of the bells. Others say the bells never stopped ringing at all. For decades after the so-called fire, the town of Willow's End carried the story like a stone in its pocket, always there, rarely spoken of. The numbered stakes in the churchyard weathered into splintered gray, their paint flaking away until only the faintest ghosts of numbers remained. Families who had lost sons visited less and less, some moving away entirely, others burying themselves in work until the faces of the boys faded into the blur of old photographs. Yet beneath the surface, the wound festered. The diocese resisted all calls for a full inquiry. Petitions were dismissed as an attempt to reopen grief and met with gentle but firm reminders that the church had already closed the matter in the eyes of God. Requests to exhume the graves were denied on grounds of sanctity, even as quiet rumors persisted that not all the numbered plots held human remains. Those who pressed the issue too loudly found themselves socially isolated, business dwindling, neighbors suddenly distant. It became easier, safer, to let the past remain behind closed doors. It wasn't until 1921, 73 years after the supposed fire, that the first public marker appeared. By then, the seminary's ruins had collapsed completely, the stones hauled away for use in other buildings, the land grown over with wild grass. A small granite plaque was placed at the site, inscribed with a single bland line, in memory of those lost to the fire of 1848. There was no mention of Father Grayson, no acknowledgement of the controversy, and certainly no hint that the fire itself might never have happened. The unveiling ceremony was quiet, attended mostly by clergy and a handful of parishioners. The families of the boys, or what remained of them, stayed away. Over the years, the story settled into two versions, the one told in sermons and Sunday school, of a tragic blaze and the pious priest who bore its sorrow with dignity, and the one told in whispers in kitchens and back rooms of chains, bells, and bodies not burned but taken. The second version was harder to pass on. As younger generations grew up without first-hand memory, they began to treat it as little more than a ghost tale, a dark embellishment to make the town seem older, stranger, more mysterious. The weight of what had happened was being worn smooth by time. Still, fragments of resistance remained. In 1965, a small advocacy group called Watchers of the Flock began lobbying for greater oversight of religious boarding schools across the state. Its founders, two retired teachers and a farmer's widow, cited the lessons of Willow's End in their materials, though the details were carefully couched to avoid libel. They pushed for laws requiring regular inspection of such institutions, independent of church authority. The campaign was slow and bitterly opposed, but over the next decade several minor reforms were passed: written records of all pupils, unrestricted correspondence with families, and the right for parents to visit without notice. Even so, for many in Willow's End, these changes felt like medicine given long after the patient had died. By the time the laws came, the boys were already decades in the ground, or wherever Grayson had taken them. The Grove of Bells, if it still existed, lay deep in private land or had been dismantled entirely. No official search was ever sanctioned. Those who knew the old logging trails had aged or passed on, taking with them the landmarks and directions that might have led the way. And yet, there were moments when the past seemed to stir. In 1978, during repairs to the rectory roof, workers found a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth tucked into a beam. Inside was a brass bell, no larger than a man's fist, its clapper bound in cloth as though to silence it. No one knew how it had come to be there. The discovery made the local paper, but the article was brief, the photo grainy, the matter forgotten within a week. The bell vanished into the diocesan archive, its location unlisted. By the turn of the century, the site of the seminary was barely recognizable. The grass was mown twice a year, the plaque scrubbed occasionally by volunteers. Visitors passed through without lingering, taking photos of the plaque as a curiosity rather than a wound. But for those who still carried the second version of the story, it remained a place of unease. Some claimed the air grew heavier as you approached, others that you could hear faint, irregular chimes when the wind shifted. Most dismissed it as tricks of the mind, the brain playing back a sound it had never truly heard. The legacy of Willow's End was not a trial, nor a confession, nor even a shared truth. It was the silence, the long, slow suffocation of questions under the weight of what people feared to know. And that silence, more than the fire or the bells or the graves, was what allowed Father Grayson's work to live far beyond him. Time has a way of sanding the edges off a crime until only the shape remains, neat enough to fit into a single line of a history book. In Willow's End, the name Father Elias Grayson now rests there. between the dates of his arrival and the line about the tragic Seminary fire. The plaque at the old site offers no photograph, no carved likeness. His face lives only in a handful of fading sketches made during his trial. The straight-backed posture, the clean line of his hair, the faintly amused downturn at the corner of his mouth. It is not the face of a monster, and that is precisely why it endured. Grayson's power did not come from fear in the moment, but from the obedience he cultivated over time. He knew that institutions once trusted could carry out their work in silence because no one wanted to imagine the opposite. He hid his methods behind the language of care, discipline, and salvation, words the townspeople already believed in, words that made the grotesque sound righteous. Even those who suspected him learned quickly that suspicion without proof was nothing but a weight around the neck, one that could drag a person under faster than any chain. The question that lingered long after his death was not why he did what he did. The journals had shown that clearly enough, but how he did it in plain sight. The answer was uncomfortably simple. He appeared necessary. In a town that had lost its old priest, he filled the void with precision, reliability, and the kind of confidence that leaves no room for doubt. People forgave the changes, the locked doors, the altered routines, because they believed they were temporary steps toward a greater good. By the time the truth began to surface, his image was so woven into the town's fabric that pulling on it meant tearing the whole cloth. The last documented mention of Grayson came in 1893 in a brief death notice from the state asylum. No cause of death was given. His burial was unmarked, somewhere on the asylum grounds, and the records that might have shown the exact location were lost in the flood of 1903. If he left instructions, no one claimed to have seen them. But the diagrams and plans found in his hidden cell compartment suggested he never believed his death would end the work. In his mind, he was not the keeper of an idea but its caretaker, one of many hands it would pass through. In the years since, small echoes of his methods have surfaced in other places. An unlicensed discipline home, shut down after the discovery of chemical burns on its wards. A rural chapel where bells were found buried under the floorboards. A boarding school in another state whose ledgers listed students who were never reported as leaving. None of these cases could be tied directly to Grayson, but for those who knew the story, the parallels were hard to ignore. The work was patient. It could wait. The philosophical question that Willow's End has never been able to shake is how evil like Grayson's survives. It does not thrive in chaos as people like to imagine. It thrives in order, in routines, in rituals, in the polite silence of those who see but do not speak. It wears the clothes of the necessary and the trusted. It moves slowly, methodically, until its presence feels like part of the natural order. And when it is finally challenged, it smiles, because by then it has already taken root somewhere else. Today, the grove of bells is gone, if it ever truly could be found again. But some still swear that on certain nights, when the wind cuts just right through the cedars, you can hear the faint, uneven chime of brass. The sound is never the same twice, as if no two bells strike together. Some say it's nothing more than branches brushing in the wind. Others stand a moment longer listening before walking away without a word. The story ends where it began, not with a blaze, not with a confession, but with a quiet question hanging in the air. What do you think? Could this happen again? In the distance, something answers with a single patient note.